What is every active Nintendo series' biggest problem in 2026? Animal Crossing survives almost entirely on how it feels, not on what it actually asks you to do, and for a while that works really well. The slow pace, the daily rituals, the rewards, it creates a sense of comfort that very few games can replicate. The problem is that once the novelty wears off, there's really not much underneath. New Horizons made this impossible to ignore. It sold absurdly well, pulled in millions of new players, and then slowly revealed how thin the systems really were. Villagers lost personality depth compared to earlier entries, progression got stretched out artificially through real-time gating, freedom mostly meant grinding for furniture or materials rather than engaging with systems that actually respond to your choices. You weren't building a town so much as maintaining one, if that makes sense. The fanbase will often defend this by pointing to relaxation, escapism, and that is totally valid. I myself really love New Horizons and the series, but those don't sidestep the core issue, which is Animal Crossing hasn't figured out a way to evolve its gameplay loop, which relies on a lot of repetition and patience. Now, there's no way to get rid of this completely, and it doesn't need to, but I feel like there's ways to just add deeper mechanics and add a lot more value that can keep a lot more people playing over time. Yoshi games are consistently nice to play, they look great, they sound great, and they rarely frustrate anyone, and that's exactly the problem. The series has become so risk-averse that it refuses to let its mechanics develop into anything demanding. Modern Yoshi entries introduce ideas that could be interesting if they were given room to breathe. Instead, mechanics show up for a level or two, get a brief showcase, and then disappear before they're ever stressed or expanded. Difficulty is smoothed out so aggressively that tension never has any chance to form, and you kind of just coast along these entire games. Just kind of feels like a franchise designed to avoid complaints rather than create any sort of excitement. Now, for what Yoshi games are, I do like them. I don't think every game needs to be Donkey Kong Country in terms of its difficulty, or it's not a ridiculously hard game but gives you a good challenge, but I just like to see a little more difficulty from Yoshi games, and more ideas really pushed more. Before we continue, I just want to explain a little bit more about how I'm formatting this video. I'm not necessarily looking at the biggest issue of one specific game, but I am trying to find the biggest issue with the series as a whole in 2026. Now, that may mean the most recent game, but whether it's gameplay mechanics that have been repeated or issues that go beyond the actual games, and also I'm only looking at Nintendo franchises with multiple games that have also had a release in the past decade. The biggest problem for something like Star Fox or Kid Icarus is simply that they haven't had a new game in so long. Now, before I get back to the video, subscribe before you see Paper Mario Sticker Star on screen. Brain Age and Big Brain Academy are games built around making you feel accomplished, not giving you something to actually master. You answer simple questions, touch the screen, get a score, and receive encouragement. It is satisfying, but it gets boring pretty quickly. These games don't really have a reason to exist outside nostalgia, and they don't teach transferable skills, no matter what they might say. Once you've played for a few sessions, you've pretty much seen everything. In a world filled with actual educational tools, mobile apps, and real cognitive training programs, these games kind of feel like artifacts from when a touchscreen felt revolutionary. Nintendo keeps them around because they're safe and recognizable and easy to market, but as games, they're not really worth the price that Nintendo's charging for it anymore. Clubhouse Games is one of the cleanest looking products Nintendo's ever released. The interface is really nice, the animations are smooth, everything feels premium here, and then you realize you paid like $50 to play chess, checkers, and dots and boxes. The entire value collapses without other people. The AI opponents are serviceable, but gives you no reason to play this. There is online mode, but how many people are actually playing random strangers in this? Nintendo basically sells the polish of this game as substance here, and for some players that's enough, but when digital board games are everywhere, Clubhouse Games just doesn't really seem that necessary. I definitely think this game is worth it for like $20 though. I've had a lot of fun with it. WarioWare is one of Nintendo's most instantly charming ideas. The first time you play it, it immediately grabs your attention. Microgames fly at you at a ridiculous pace, the humor lands fast, and the chaos keeps you into it. For a few hours, it's hard not to love it. The problem is that WarioWare has never figured out what happens after that initial rush fades. The entire series is built around surprise. You don't know what's coming next, the instructions are intentionally vague, and half the time the joke is the confusion. It works a few times, but once you understand that and you've seen most of the microgames, the experience flattens out fast. No longer reacting anymore, but you're just recognizing the patterns. And that's kind of where WarioWare loses its magic. This isn't a huge problem because WarioWare is treated more like a novelty release, something fun to drop between larger titles, not a franchise that needs long-term growth. New entries add motion controls, new art styles, or character gimmicks, but they rarely address the core issue, and honestly, they don't really need to. I call this an issue just because it will keep a lot of people from playing this much, but it also is pretty intentional, so take that as you will. Also, just a side note, can we get a new Wario Land game already? Fire Emblem. So this is one that you could find a lot of problems for depending on who you ask, because so many people have widely different views on this series. In my opinion, it's just trying to satisfy too many audiences at once, and in doing so, it kind of muddies its own strengths. Modern entries are massive, they've huge cast, endless dialogue, layered systems, relationship mechanics, class trees, side activities. On paper, that sounds like a lot of depth, which is what you probably want from a strategy RPG, but in practice, it often just seems like a little too much. For new players, the sheer volume of mechanics is overwhelming. Tutorials drag on, menus stack in menus, and it's not always clear which systems actually matter. For longtime fans, the frustration comes from the opposite direction. Difficulty swings wildly, some entries feel tuned for newcomers, others spike aggressively, and the balance between strategy and social simulation keeps shifting without ever settling. The anime aesthetic and relationship focus aren't inherently problems, but they've become dominant enough to overshadow the core of the series. Battles just start to feel like they're connecting support conversations rather than what you're playing for at times. Feels like Fire Emblem wants to be deep and accessible at the same time. And I've asked around for this because I'm not really a big Fire Emblem fan, so take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt, but it really does seem like Fire Emblem has kind of been split into many different factions. Pikmin is often described as a thoughtful, strategic series, but much of its difficulty comes from stress rather than planning. Time limits loom constantly, your army is fragile, and while these are intentional, the AI behavior can turn small mistakes into disasters. When things go wrong, it doesn't always feel like you were outplayed, it feels like you were babysitting a group that refused to listen. The time pressure may be seen as an issue by some people, and yes, it does limit exploration and experimenting, but that also is the point. But the combat of this, with the AI Pikmin just not always cooperating, is in my opinion the biggest issue with what is a fantastic series. Luigi's Mansion is carried almost entirely by presentation. The animations, the haunted environments, the playful tone, all of it's executed wonderfully, but once you look past that surface, the gameplay systems haven't evolved much at all. Combat revolves around the same flashlight and vacuum loop it's always been. Boss fights remix that idea without pushing it into genuinely new territory. Puzzles are enjoyable, but it feels like they rarely build on each other in ways that demand growing understanding or skill. Exploration looks meaningful, but it's often more cosmetic. The series is fun, and it knows exactly what it wants to be aesthetically. The issue is that Nintendo seems content letting charm compensate for a lot of this. These are still very fun games, but I'd like to see the series progress a little more in the next game. Another one like with Fire Emblem where people are going to have widely different answers. Every entry in the series is massive, systems heavy, and packed with ideas. The problem is that the series still doesn't know when to stop. Scale has become the selling point, but at the cost of pacing. Modern Xenoblade games drown players in mechanics early on. Tutorials stretch for hours. New systems keep unlocking long after the game should trust you to understand what you're doing. And combat feedback often remains unclear even deep into the experience. World size is another issue. The environments are huge and impressive, but meaningful interaction doesn't scale with them. You spend enormous stretches running through empty terrain while party members repeat the same voice lines waiting for the next story beat. Xenoblade asks for dozens of hours before it gives anything back in return, and that lack of restraint is increasingly hard to defend. As someone who really loves Xenoblade Chronicles X, it's been hard for me to get into other games in the series just because it asks you to play so much before it actually starts to get more interesting. I don't know about you, but I don't want to play 20 hours before I start to enjoy a game. Splatoon wants to be two things at once: a casual, friendly shooter anyone can pick up, and a competitive game with serious skill and expression. The problem is that it still hasn't figured out how to reconcile those goals. New players are thrown into matches with little guidance, minimal separation of skill levels, and an expectation that they'll simply figure things out through repeated losses. Matchmaking remains inconsistent. You can play well and still lose repeatedly due to team composition, lag, or balance quirks, and the game does a poor job of explaining what you could have done differently. Ranked modes exist, but progression doesn't always feel tied to improvement, which makes the climb frustrating rather than motivating. Splatoon's great, it's one of Nintendo's most creative series. The style, the music, the aesthetic, it carries a lot of what makes the series so fun, but the cracks are obvious here. Like, if this game didn't have its own unique identity, I feel like it would have a lot less players tolerating how messy the competitive experience still feels. Kirby games are always polished, charming, and welcoming, but like with Yoshi, they just refuse to push the player. Every modern entry introduces new mechanics that could support interesting challenges, but then wraps them in an experience so forgiving that the mechanics never really feel like they get tested in meaningful ways. Copy abilities often feel interchangeable because the game rarely demands precision or strategy. Bosses are visually impressive but mechanically simple. Levels introduce ideas and then move on before asking players to master them. Fans will point to optional content or post-game modes, but that only reinforces the idea. Its difficulty is hidden behind content most players are just never going to touch, and then the core experience remains shallower. The series has the tools to do more, but it consistently chooses not to. The result are games that are enjoyable in the moment, but sometimes easy to forget. The Mario and Luigi series is beloved largely because of its writing and personality. The time-based combat is fun, expressive, and immediately satisfying, especially early on, but it's been a very long time since we got what many would consider to be a masterpiece. Paper Jam came out a decade ago and was just such a boring game that completely missed on what was such a creative idea. Then after 8 years of no new games, we get Brothership, to which its credit is an improvement and worth playing for fans of the series, but something about it just feels like it's missing. Like, play the original 3 games, maybe even Dream Team, and compare it to Brothership, and it just kind of seems like it's not all there. Mario Kart has perfected chaos to the point where it actively undermines itself. I get it's supposed to be a party game first and a competitive game second, but even with that, it feels like it's trying to help out players towards the back of the pack a little too much. Rubber banding, item distribution, and late race swings are just so aggressive that individual performance often feels secondary to luck. You can drive cleanly for an entire race, maintain first place through smart drifting and track knowledge, and still lose everything and have 23 players pass you in a second because the game decided to spam blue shells at you or give every player in the back a bullet bill. Now, I understand this doesn't need to be a competitive game, but something like Mario Kart World I feel like just pushed too far on luck. Advance Wars didn't just struggle to come back, its revival was actively sabotaged. Charging full price for a remake of a new strategy series on the GBA already set expectations high, and then repeated delays drained what little momentum it had. By the time it finally released, the moment had already passed. The remake didn't do enough to modernize onboarding, pacing, or accessibility to justify its price point, especially for newcomers. Veterans were happy to revisit the games, but that audience was never large enough to carry a $60 release on its own. The delayed discourse created awareness, but not demand of it, and once the game arrived, most of that attention evaporated. Advance Wars exist in a strange limbo. Nintendo proved it remembers the series, but it also proved it doesn't know how to position it for modern audiences. The biggest problem isn't the gameplay, it's that Nintendo just completely screwed up the remake. Art Academy presents itself as a creative outlet, but in practice it functions more like a digital workbook. The series is very good at walking players through specific steps, teaching them how to replicate an image and rewarding accuracy. What it's far less interested in is helping players actually create something of their own. The lessons are rigid by design, you follow instructions, match shapes, fill in colors, and end with something that looks nice. And I mean, that's fine, but the tools are limited, the freedom is constrained, and the game really never pushes you to develop a personal style. There really isn't too much of a reason to play this nowadays, unless you're just a big fan of what it offers. Because with everyone having tablets and Apple Pencils or other things like that, there's much more in-depth tools people could use. Famicom Detective Club is probably a series a lot of you haven't even heard of, and it's often praised as proof that Nintendo can do mature, narrative-focused experiences. And to their credit, the atmospheres are strong in these games, and the presentation in the remake is excellent, but just like with so many other visual novel-type games, there's just very little gameplay that really supports the storytelling. Now, some of you may not feel like that's an issue, but it just feels like there's a lack of interactivity that's just hard to overlook. So Mario Party is a series that's had different issues throughout its history. Before the past few years, the issue was the kart-based gameplay, and that was one of the dumbest things Nintendo could have done, and they did it twice. While I still like some of the modern Mario Party games on Switch, it just feels like the boards, which are usually the backbone of the experience, continue to feel underdeveloped. If you go back to some of the older Mario Party games, ending with what I want to say maybe Mario Party 8, it just feels like there's a lot less strategy on the boards. Minigames are still very fun, but it feels like it's kind of carrying the experience, rather than when it felt like the board was carrying the experience. BoxBoy is a clever, well-designed, and easy-to-recommend game, and I am including it because we did get one in the past decade, but the series rarely pushes beyond its initial hook. Visual minimalism works in its favor early on, keeping the focus on puzzles. Over time, though, that restraint makes the experience blur together. New mechanics arrive slowly, complexity ramps conservatively, and by the time things start to get interesting, the game's already nearing its conclusion. This is a fun series that doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's not the most memorable game of all time. Picross has reached a point where it's almost too good at what it does. The puzzles are clean, the rules are clear, and the experience is exactly what fans expect every single time. And that's the problem. The series has been mechanically complete for years, and Nintendo has shown little interest in pushing it anywhere new. I mean, that's not really that much of an issue. If you like Picross, you're gonna like the new Picross game, but I feel like that can definitely limit the fan base of this, because there's very little variety here. F-Zero is often brought up as a franchise Nintendo needs to bring back, and I feel like the reason it hasn't returned in a meaningful way is right there in its design. These games demand a lot of work from the player. Speed is extreme, reaction windows are narrow, and mistakes are punished immediately and brutally. For a small audience, it's really fun, but it does narrow the appeal of this. There's very little ramp up, and you're expected to learn through failure, but failure in F-Zero can feel like a gut punch. F-Zero's problem isn't that it's bad or outdated, it's that it's just unapologetically hostile to new players. Reviving it would probably require lowering that barrier, and lowering that barrier risks risk alienating the only audience still asking for it. And also, I am just including this because we got F-Zero 99, so not a full new game, but I use that as an excuse to include this. Pokemon, the one everyone's been waiting for. This series has quite a lot of problems, and I think even the biggest Pokemon fans will agree with that. Pokemon's biggest issue is actually pretty ironic, and I would say it's the success. The series sells so well, so consistently, that meaningful change is never required. Every generation follows the same cycle of hype, release, and disappointment, and then retroactive praise once the next game comes along. The problems are extremely well documented at this point. Technical performance lags behind industry standards, visuals feel unfinished, difficulties flattened to the point of disengagement, mechanics are introduced and abandoned without refinement, and yet none of this stops the games from selling millions almost immediately. It just sends a message to Game Freak that improvement is optional. Some fans will excuse these issues endlessly, saying it's for kids, or deadlines are tight, the Pokemon company is juggling too much. All of that may be true, but none of it changes the outcome. The series continues to coast because it can. Pokemon isn't struggling to evolve, get it? It doesn't push the series forward, and it just feels stale. Also, in Legend Z to A, graphics just suck for a Switch game, and especially a Switch 2 game. I mean, what is this? Just go back a little more than a decade, look at Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which were amazing remakes. Look at Black and White. These are games that came out a couple generations ago and really show what a Pokemon game can be. Zelda is a very hard series to find a biggest issue for. It consistently gets games that are very different, and while some people say the biggest issue now is the Breath of the Wild style gameplay, I wouldn't say that's true. I love Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but I think the biggest issue with modern Zelda is just that it feels like a lot of old Zelda mechanics have been abandoned. I want to see some more traditional dungeons, I want to even see some more traditional items, and I want there to be more sweeping stories like we had in some older games, because emotional moments in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do exist, but they don't feel the same. We're probably a couple years away from new 3D Zelda, but I would love for Nintendo to find a way to balance this. Mario, specifically the main series, is the gold standard of consistency. The controls are always tight, the level design is clean, and the game almost delivers exactly what players expect, and that reliability has quietly become the series' biggest limitation. Now, I'm not saying games don't take creative risk, but it feels like newer games have just been a little too easy. Like it wants to be too accessible. Mario Odyssey, for as great as the game is, doesn't have many challenges in the main game, and with how perfect the movement is in the game, it's led to more fan challenges than actual challenges in the game, outside of some of the special levels. That's just my biggest problem with it. There's probably a bunch of other things you could find. And if you asked me a few years ago before Mario Wonder, I would say the series just being a little too stale, because outside of Mario Odyssey, and this is before Wonder, the series pretty much had the same aesthetic and didn't feel like it wanted to take any risk. Now, I love Tomodachi Life, and I'm making an exception to my rules I stated to include it because we are getting a new game this year. It's an incredibly fun game with a lot of quirky humor and ideas, and it's one of my favorite 3DS games of all time. With that being said, the game can feel pretty shallow once you get past that. Mies can make friends, hang out, date, get married, and have children, but it just feels very limiting. Besides that, it feels like there's so much more you could do. What about customizing your island, or having certain Mies get jobs, friend groups they can consistently hang out with, more side activities that have more depth? This might all be remedied by living the dream, but we'll have to see. Paper Mario has spent seemingly the last 15 years trying to correct itself, possibly even longer depending on who you ask. After the first two games followed the same formula that people loved, Intelligent Systems changed up with Super Paper Mario, which, while very different, was still a very popular game. But then Sticker Star came out, widely considered to be one of the biggest critical flops in Mario history. Instead of reverting back to either of the two formulas people loved, Nintendo has only made sequels to Sticker Star with Color Splash and Origami King. Say what you want about Origami King, you could say it's a much better game, but it definitely has a similar formula to Sticker Star. And that's the biggest issue, because Paper Mario, when I think of it, is a series with unique characters, unique environments, a great story, and the new games in the series have just missed that mark. Mario sports games used to feel like playful twists on familiar rules. They weren't realistic, but they had character. They had unique animations, exaggerated physics, and small touches that reminded you this was still a Mario game, not just a basic sports game. In recent years, that personality is quietly drained out of the series. Modern entries often launch feeling bare bones, mechanics are simplified, modes are limited, and the presentation feels oddly restrained. Look at Mario Strikers Battle League, for example. Characters are there, but they don't do much, animations feel standardized, and it feels like a lot of the charm of the older Mario sports games is gone. Now, Nintendo often patches or expands these games later, but that just reinforces the problem that they feel unfinished at launch, and even when content is added, the soul doesn't really come back. This could all change with Mario Tennis Fever, which we're getting this month, but that remains to be seen. And lastly, I want to finish with the Wii/Switch Sports series. When Wii Sports and Wii Sports Resort first came out, it was a go-to party game. Nintendo Switch Sports exist because motion controls still sell the idea of accessibility. You swing your arm, move your body, kick in Nintendo Switch Sports. And while that worked during the Wii era, it feels just kind of tired now. Nintendo Switch Sports for $50 just isn't justified in my opinion to only play a few games that are still very simple. The game isn't bad at all, it's just thin. Motion controls are still treated as the main attraction instead of the foundation for deeper gameplay. It feels like that limitation defines the entire series, and we're just looking for a little more at this point from it. And that's the biggest issue in every Nintendo series in my opinion. You're not going to agree with all these, some of these you may not see as issues, some of them you might think have bigger issues, but that's what the comment section is for. If you disagree with me, let me know. What do you think is the biggest issue in your favorite Nintendo series? And also keep in mind, I don't hate any of these series. In fact, a lot of these are some of my favorite video game series of all time, but none of them are going to be completely perfect. Some of these aren't huge issues, but I had to find something for them, so don't take this as me hating on any of these series, but just going over some things I hope can be improved in the future. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe and join my Discord, and I'll see you next time.